In the spring of 1886, settlers across Montana territories, Judith Basin watched a widow do something that defied every rule of frontier sense. Cordelia Hatch was pressing sunflower seeds into the soil along the very base of her cabin. Not in a garden plot, not behind a fence, not even a few feet away where a flower bed might be reasonable. The seeds went directly against the foundation logs, forming a continuous band around the entire homestead. At first, neighbors riding past assumed the widow was trying to cheer the place up. A homestead could grow grim after a hard winter, and a circle of bright yellow blooms might lift the spirit of a woman raising a child alone. But the planting did not stop after one wall, or two, or three. Day after day, Cordelia worked her way around the structure with the patience of someone following a plan no one else could see. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emmeline, walked behind her, dragging a cloth sack of seeds along the dirt. An aging collie named Banjo dozed in whatever patch of shade the cabin happened to cast, lifting his head only when a wagon passed too close. By the end of the second week, every wall of the cabin stood inside a freshly turned ring of earth. That was when the talk began. On the frontier, warm spring days were currency. A man could spend a single dry afternoon mending a roof that might otherwise leak through an entire season, or splitting wood that would keep his family warm in February. Hours given over to ornamental flowers were hours stolen from the work that decided whether a homestead survived the next winter or stood empty by April. It was Josiah Reed, a sheep rancher whose grazing land bordered the Hatch place to the south, who finally rode up to the fence line one evening and asked the question everyone else had been muttering at the trading post. He leaned across his saddle horn and watched her press another seed into the row before he spoke. "What's the planting for, Mrs. Hatch?" Cordelia did not look up. "The flowers are for the cabin," she said. That was all. No further word came. Josiah waited for an explanation that might bring the sentence into sense, but none arrived. He glanced at the seed ring, then at the timber walls behind it, then back at the widow. Somehow the answer had left him with less understanding than the question. He rode home that night and shared the exchange with his wife. By the following Sunday, the story had reached the church. By the Sunday after, it had reached the sawmill, where men spent slow afternoons waiting on lumber and trading opinions about everyone else's business. Within a month, the homestead had earned itself a name. Some called it the Sunflower Widow's Place. Others, less kindly, called it the Yellow Folly. Ezra Whitcomb, who ran the supply post at the crossroads and held credit notes on nearly half the families in the basin, declared the project a waste of growing, whether better spent on something useful. Silas Pendry, a carpenter who had raised cabins from the Dakotas down to Colorado, laughed openly when he heard the description. "Flowers," he said, "don't stop wind, and they don't stop snow, and they sure don't keep a cabin from rotting where it stands." Most people who heard the line nodded along. Cordelia heard the talk. In a basin of that size, no one could avoid hearing the talk, yet she did not defend herself. She did not visit the trading post to argue her case. She did not turn up at the church social with an explanation. She simply rose before dawn each morning, ate breakfast with her daughter, walked outside, and continued working her ring of seeds. The silence puzzled people more than the planting itself, and somewhere beneath the laughter, a small handful of older settlers began to wonder whether the widow knew something the rest of the basin did not. Because in country like the Judith Basin, the only true judge of any frontier decision was the season that came afterward, and winter of 1886 had not yet rendered its verdict. The talk about the Sunflower Widow's cabin moved through every conversation in the Judith Basin during the long weeks of June, yet on the Hatch homestead itself, very little appeared to shift. A patched wool coat still hung from a peg behind the front door. A worn felling axe rested beside the iron stove, its handle darkened by years of use. Neither item had been moved since the autumn of 1883, when Daniel Hatch had ridden out toward the eastern ranges to look for a missing pair of horses and never come back. Some nights, when the lamp burned low and Emmeline had already fallen asleep beneath her quilt, Banjo would stretch out beside the empty chair near the stove and lay his head across his paws, as if waiting for a familiar boot to step through the door. One warm evening near the end of the month, while pale gold light still lingered above the western ridges, Emmeline knelt on the bench by the window and pressed her fingers against the glass. She watched the small green shoots that had begun pushing through the soil along the cabin wall. "Mama," she said quietly, "would Father have liked the flowers?" Cordelia paused over the cord she was knotting around a loose section of fence rail. Her hands stilled for a moment, and she glanced toward the cabin and the low row of seedlings just beginning to find the sun. The answer never came. Outside, the small green shoots kept reaching upward. Inside, certain preparations for winter carried a meaning deeper than warmth alone, and Cordelia did not yet have the words to explain them to her daughter, perhaps because she had not entirely explained them to herself. The idea had not begun in Montana. Years earlier, before the homestead, before Daniel, before Emmeline had even been born, Cordelia had lived as a young bride in a small farming community along the eastern edge of the Dakota Territory. Her husband's grandmother, a woman of Norwegian descent whose family had passed through Wisconsin before drifting west, had lived in a sod-roofed house at the edge of that settlement. The old woman had spoken with an accent that softened her English into something musical, and she had carried with her certain habits brought across the ocean that her American neighbors found peculiar. One of those habits involved sunflowers. The settlers in that Dakota community planted them everywhere, not for beauty, but for use. The seeds fed children through the lean months. The oil pressed from the heads burned in lamps. But it was what the old woman did with the dried stalks after harvest that lingered in Cordelia's memory. She had bundled them and stacked them against her root cellar, against her smokehouse, against the small shed where her milk cow took shelter in the worst storms. Cordelia, only 19 at the time and uncertain about her place in this new family, had asked her grandmother-in-law why she did it. The old woman had set down the cord she was wrapping and looked at the young bride with patient eyes. "The cold," she said in her careful English, "the cold hunts walls. It searches for them. It feels along them. It finds every weakness. So you give it something else to find first. You give it a wall it cannot win against because the wall is not solid. The wall is full of air, and the cold cannot defeat the air. It can only pass through and grow tired." At the time, the words had sounded to Cordelia like a fragment of folklore, the sort of saying that older women carried out of habit more than belief. She had nodded politely and forgotten the conversation by the following spring. But now, standing on her own Montana homestead more than a decade later, with a daughter to feed and a husband who would not return, and a winter always waiting somewhere beyond the big snowy mountains, she understood at last that the old woman had not been sharing a superstition. She had been describing a system, a method tested by generations of women who had buried husbands and raised children through winters that could kill an unprepared family in a single night. And Cordelia had finally begun to listen to it, not with the politeness of a young bride, but with the attention of a woman who had already lost too much to lose anything more. By the middle of August, the sunflowers along the cabin walls had grown taller than Cordelia herself. Their broad green leaves overlapped one another like a thatched skirt, and the yellow heads that crowned the tallest stalks turned slowly through each day to follow the sun's path across the basin. Every wagon that passed the property on the road between the trading post and the lower grazing land slowed instinctively, the driver craning his neck to study the strange yellow band wrapped around the timber walls. The cabin had become a landmark, though not the sort any settler would have chosen. Then the wind came. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon without much warning, sweeping down from the western ridges with the sudden violence the Montana Territory was famous for. The sky had been clear at noon. By 2 o'clock, dust was rolling in low brown sheets across the open flats, and loose boards along the chicken coop began rattling against their nails. A length of split-rail fencing near the creek collapsed under a gust strong enough to bend the grass flat against the ground. Inside the cabin, Cordelia held Emmeline close to her and listened to the air howling around the eaves. Banjo pressed against her knee with his ears laid back. When the worst of it finally eased near sundown, Cordelia opened the door and stepped outside. The damage to the property was scattered but real. A section of the chicken coop roof had lifted and twisted. A bucket from the well had rolled clear across the yard. But it was the western wall of the cabin that drew her eye first, and her breath caught in her throat at what she saw. Nearly a third of the sunflowers along that side lay flattened against the dirt. Broken stalks stretched across the ground like fallen spears, their yellow heads crushed into the earth. Silas Pendry happened to be riding home along the Basin Road that evening when he spotted the ruined section. He reined in his horse and sat there for a long moment, studying the scene with the satisfied expression of a man whose predictions had finally arrived. He shook his head once slowly and rode on without dismounting. By the next morning, the story had reached every household within 10 miles. Some neighbors assumed the experiment had reached its natural conclusion. Others nodded knowingly and predicted the remaining stalks would follow with the next hard blow. A few of the women at the trading post murmured among themselves that perhaps now the poor widow would turn her attention back to the work that actually mattered before snow came. What none of them expected was what happened the following morning. Cordelia was outside before the sun had cleared the eastern ridges. She walked along the flattened row with Emmeline at her side and a coil of fresh hemp cord slung over her shoulder. She did not curse, did not weep, did not stand staring at the damage in the dazed way a defeated person might. She simply began work. The stalks that could be lifted, she lifted. The ones that had snapped clean through at the base were carried away to the wood pile, where their dried stems would still earn their place later in the season. Then she drove fresh support stakes deep into the soil along the western side, each one set at an angle calculated to brace against the prevailing wind. She lashed the standing stalks to the stakes with careful turns of cord, and then she ran additional lines from plant to plant, weaving the entire row into a single connected mass that could share the load whenever the wind returned. The work took the better part of 4 days. Emmeline carried water and seeds in small bundles of cord. Banjo circled the cabin endlessly, nudging the curious sheep away from the freshly tended row whenever they drifted too near. By the end of the week, the western side of the cabin stood again, and any honest observer would have admitted that it stood differently than before. Not identical to its previous form, but in some ways stronger. The damaged section had not been merely restored. It had been rebuilt with the knowledge gained from its first failure. Silas Pendry noticed. So did Josiah Reed. Neither man spoke of it, but a quiet uncertainty had begun working its way through the basin, even if no one yet possessed the words to name it. The collapse of the western row gave Silas Pendry the opening he had been waiting for. He rode out to the Hatch homestead the following Tuesday under the pretense of looking at a section of fencing Cordelia had mentioned needing repair at the previous month's church social. The fence was an excuse, and both of them knew it. What Silas had really come for was the conversation he had been rehearsing in his head for weeks. He dismounted near the south wall, where Cordelia was kneeling beside a freshly trimmed stalk, securing a loose binding. He let his horse crop the grass and walked the length of the wall slowly, examining the rows the way a builder examines another man's work. Silas Pendry had raised more than 24 cabins across 3 territories. Some of them still stood. A few had survived winters harsh enough to become local legend. When Silas Pendry spoke about how timber behaved in cold country, men listened. "You're making trouble for yourself, Mrs. Hatch," he said at last. He stopped a few feet from where she worked. Cordelia tied another knot and waited for him to continue. She did not look up. "These plants," he said, gesturing along the wall, "they'll hold moisture against your logs. Every dew, every rain, every snow that catches in them, the water has to go somewhere. It sits there. It works its way into the chinking, and moisture in chinking becomes rot. Rot becomes repairs you can't afford on a place like this without a man around to swing an axe." He paused, and his voice softened slightly because Silas was not a cruel man, only a certain one. "And then the mice will come," he added. "They always come. You give them this much cover against your walls, and they'll move in before the first hard frost. You'll have a nest behind every log by November. Every word he spoke carried the weight of experience. Every man within 50 miles knew that damp wood failed eventually. Every family in the basin had fought a war against rodents at some point in their settling. Silas was not speaking from arrogance. He was speaking from 20 years of evidence gathered with his own hands. Josiah Reed had ridden up during the conversation and was leaning against his saddle a polite distance away. He found himself agreeing with nearly every sentence the carpenter spoke. The argument made sense. It made the kind of sense that frontier men trusted, the sense built from broken roofs and ruined seasons and the slow accumulated lessons of survival. Silas took another step closer to the wall. Wood needs to breathe, Mrs. Hatch. It needs air around it. It needs light on it. You wrap it up like this, and you're suffocating the very thing meant to keep you alive in February. For the first time since he had begun speaking, Cordelia paused. She set down the length of cord in her hands and rose to her full height. She looked at the row she had spent the entire summer cultivating. Then she turned and looked at the cabin itself, at the timber walls that had sheltered her family through 3 winters already, at the chinking she herself had repacked with her own hands after Daniel had failed to return. A breeze moved through the leaves of the sunflowers, and somewhere behind the cabin, Banjo barked once at a sheep that had wandered too close to the kitchen garden. Silas waited. He expected an argument or perhaps a request for advice he was prepared to give freely. What he received instead was the sight of Cordelia bending back down to her work. She picked up the cord. She tied the next knot. She did not raise her voice. She did not justify the planting. She did not thank him for his concern. She simply continued. To Silas, the silence felt less like confidence and more like the particular stubbornness that grief sometimes left behind in a person. He climbed back into his saddle and rode away, convinced that winter would settle the argument for him. Josiah followed a few minutes later, his earlier sympathy now firmly attached to the carpenter's view. By the time the 2 men reached the crossroads, both had agreed that the poor widow was making a mistake the basin would talk about for years, though neither of them yet suspected which direction the talking would eventually run. September arrived in the Judith Basin with mornings cold enough to silver the grass, and the bright yellow heads that had drawn so much attention through the summer began to bow beneath the weight of their own ripening seeds. Their broad green leaves yellowed, then browned, then curled inward. The stalks themselves hardened day by day, the soft fibers of midsummer giving way to a tough, almost woody fiber that resisted the bending touch of the wind. For Cordelia Hatch, the real work of the year was only beginning. She harvested a portion of the seed crop carefully, breaking the largest heads from their stalks and laying them out across an old wool blanket on the cabin floor to dry. The seeds would feed her and Emmeline through the coldest months, would press into oil for the lamp on the long winter evenings, and would set aside enough surplus to plant again the following spring. But the majority of the heads she left attached to their stems, and the stems themselves she left rooted in the ground for the time being. Every plant had a second purpose now, and Cordelia had been planning that purpose since the first thaw of March. The transformation began on a cool Saturday morning in the second week of September. Cordelia cut the stalks at the base, one by one, working her way around the cabin from the south wall toward the east. Each stalk she trimmed of its remaining leaves but left the seed heads attached, because the broad dried heads held shape and bulk in a way that mattered for what she intended. She gathered the cut stalks into bundles of roughly a dozen each, lashed them tightly with hemp cord, and stacked them in long neat rows along the side of the woodshed where the wind could continue to dry them. By the end of the second week of September, the cabin stood exposed once again, the soil along its base bare and slightly turned. To anyone passing on the road, it looked as though the widow had finally come to her senses and torn out the strange ornamental ring before winter arrived. Ezra Whitcomb mentioned at the trading post that the woman had perhaps recovered her judgment after all. A few of the older men nodded approvingly. The matter, they assumed, had quietly resolved itself. Then the third week of September began, and the second phase of the work commenced. Cordelia carried the dried bundles from the woodshed back to the cabin one at a time. She did not stack them carelessly. She set the first bundle at the northwest corner, the side that took the worst of the prevailing winter wind, and she pressed it against the foundation logs with deliberate care. The thick base of the stalks formed the bottom of the layer, and she packed them tightly enough that they held themselves in place. Above that first course, she laid another, this one with the seed heads woven into the gaps between stems, filling spaces a mason might have packed with smaller stones. Smaller stalks she used to fill the seams between bundles, and broken pieces of stem she pushed into any remaining hollow. Emmeline worked alongside her mother every afternoon after her morning lessons at the kitchen table. The girl carried bundles two at a time, her arms wrapped around the rough stalks, her small face set in the same patient concentration her mother wore. Banjo followed wherever the work moved, his gray muzzle low to the ground, occasionally sniffing at a fallen seed before settling himself in whatever sun he could find. The work proceeded slowly. A single wall took nearly 5 full days. By the 1st of October, the north wall had almost vanished beneath a dense, fibrous covering of stalks, leaves, woven seed heads, and the countless trapped pockets of still air that lived between them. The east wall followed by the middle of the month. The south and west walls were completed before the first hard frost. To a stranger riding past, the cabin no longer looked entirely like a cabin. It looked like something half buried in dried summer growth, like a shelter the basin itself had quietly grown around. And as the October sky began to take on the pale, washed quality that always preceded a hard Montana winter, Cordelia Hatch stood back from her finished work and allowed herself, for the first time all year, a moment of something resembling satisfaction. The trouble arrived 3 mornings after the last bundle had been tied into place. Cordelia stepped outside with her coffee tin in one hand and walked her usual inspection circuit along the base of the cabin, the way she now did every morning before lighting the stove. She had reached the western wall when she stopped. A patch of stalks near the foundation had been disturbed. Small bits of stem littered the dirt below it, and when she crouched down and pulled back the outer layer, she found exactly what Silas Pendry had warned her about: mice. A small nest of them, already burrowed into the soft inner fibers of one of the lower bundles. The damage was minor, no more than the volume of a man's fist, but the meaning of it was not minor at all. If the rodents had found one section in 3 nights, they would find 100 more by Christmas. The structure she had spent half the year building would become a tenement for every mouse, vole, and pack rat in the basin, and the warnings the carpenter had delivered against her south wall in August would arrive at her door in full force. Cordelia sat back on her heels and looked at the small hollow in the bundle for a long time. Then she rose and walked back inside. Emmeline looked up from her primer at the kitchen table. "Mama." Cordelia did not answer immediately. She crossed to the shelf above the stove and took down a small cloth pouch she had not opened since the previous autumn. Inside the pouch were dried sprigs of mountain sage, gathered from the slopes south of the property, and tied with them several bundles of sweetgrass she had cut from a damp hollow near the creek. The smell of them filled the cabin when she opened the pouch, a sharp green fragrance that even Banjo lifted his head to investigate. That afternoon she returned to the western wall with her cutting knife and a basket of the dried herbs, and she undid the better part of 2 days' work without hesitation. She pulled the affected bundle apart, removed the nesting material, and began rebuilding the section. But this time, into every layer of stalks, she pressed handfuls of crushed sage and woven lengths of sweetgrass. The strong oils in the sage and the sharp scent of the dried grass filled the spaces between the stems. She packed the herbal material most heavily near the foundation, where the rodents preferred to travel along the cool, damp ground, and lighter as the layers rose toward the eaves where mice rarely bothered to climb. The repair cost her nearly 6 hours of fresh labor on a section that had been finished only 3 days before. Emmeline watched from a distance and asked once whether they were starting over. "Not over," her mother said. "Better." The girl considered that for a moment and then went back to carrying bundles of fresh sage from the porch. Over the following week, Cordelia worked her way around the entire cabin a second time, opening selected sections of every wall and seeding them with the herbal protection she had nearly forgotten to include. The work added 5 full days to a project she had thought complete. It also exhausted nearly her entire supply of dried sage, and she sent Emmeline twice to the southern slopes with a small basket and a pair of shears to gather more from the wild stands that grew between the rocks. The result, when she finished the last section near the southeast corner, was almost immediate. Within 3 days, the small scratchings and disturbances that had been appearing each morning ceased entirely. By the end of the second week, she could find no fresh sign of any rodent anywhere along the cabin's circumference. Banjo, who had taken to sleeping with one eye open during the height of the problem, returned to his old habit of dozing soundly through the night beside the stove. What Silas Pendry had predicted as inevitable had instead become the very test that strengthened the design. The walls now held a second defense that had not existed in any of his cabins or in any of Ezra Whitcomb's storehouses. And while the basin slept through the last warm nights of October, the sunflower skin around the Hatch homestead grew quietly more complete than even its builder had originally planned, scented now with the dry, sharp breath of sage that no mouse in Montana cared to push past. By the last week of October, another unusual object had taken its place inside the Hatch cabin. It hung from a small nail driven into the wall opposite the stove, far enough away that the direct heat would not influence its reading, but close enough that Cordelia could check it from the kitchen table without rising. A thermometer. She had ordered it through the trading post the previous spring, paying for it with the proceeds from a bolt of homespun cloth she had woven through the long evenings after Daniel's disappearance. Beside the thermometer, resting on a small shelf, sat a slim leather-bound ledger book and a stub of pencil tied to the cover with a length of fishing line. Every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, Cordelia rose, walked to the wall, and recorded the temperature. She noted the outside temperature when she could read the second thermometer she kept on the north side of the porch, sheltered from direct sun. She marked how many sticks of firewood had been burned during the previous 12 hours. She wrote down whether the stove had required banking during the night, and how long the heat had held between feedings. Each entry was brief, no more than a single line of small, careful handwriting, and the ledger filled slowly as the autumn deepened. To anyone watching, the practice looked tedious in the extreme. Most settlers in the basin measured winter the way their grandparents had measured it, by the discomfort of their hands and the depth of the snow against the door. They did not write numbers about it. Numbers were for merchants and bankers and men in the eastern cities who counted things for a living. A frontier woman with a child to raise had better uses for her evenings than scribbling figures in a book that nobody would ever read. Ezra Whitcomb said exactly that when he stopped by the homestead in the third week of October to discuss the winter supply order Cordelia would need to settle by Christmas. He had stepped inside out of the wind for a cup of coffee, and his eye had fallen on the open ledger lying on the kitchen table. He had read a few entries before Cordelia returned from the pantry with the cream pitcher. He grinned at her in a way that was not quite unkind but not quite respectful either. "You can write numbers all the day long, Mrs. Hatch," he said, settling back into the chair. "Won't change the weather 1 degree. The Lord doesn't read ledgers." Cordelia poured his coffee without expression. "The figures aren't for the Lord, Mr. Whitcomb," she said. Ezra laughed at that and let the matter drop. He told the story at the trading post the following Saturday, and it earned a round of appreciative chuckles among the men gathered around the wood stove. The Sunflower Widow, they said, was now keeping accounts on the weather itself. What none of them realized was that the ledger had already begun answering questions that the basin had been asking all summer, even if the answers were still too small and too quiet to be heard outside the cabin walls. The numbers showed something curious. Through the cooling weeks of October, while neighboring homesteads had begun to burn 3 and 4 sticks of firewood per night to hold their interior temperatures, the Hatch cabin was holding its warmth on barely half that. The walls themselves seemed reluctant to surrender the heat they had absorbed during the day. The stove worked, but it did not labor. Outside the cabin, meanwhile, The basin itself was beginning to issue its own silent warnings, the sort that no thermometer could record. Old Tobias Hennessy, who had trapped beaver in the Judith country since before the war and who read the weather the way other men read scripture, had grown quieter than usual at the trading post. He spent more time looking north than speaking, and on the rare evenings he did speak, he spoke about things he had seen in 1864 and 1872, hard years that the younger settlers knew only as stories. When pressed, he would not predict outright. He would only say that the elk had moved down too early, that the geese had passed 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and that the ice on the upper creeks had begun forming in places where ice had no business forming in October. The laughter at the trading post grew shorter after Tobias spoke. Winter, the basin slowly realized, was preparing something it had not shown them in years. The storm arrived on the night of December 14, 1886, and the Judith Basin would speak of it for the next 40 years. The day itself had begun in deceptive calm. A thin overcast had drifted in from the northwest before dawn, and the temperature, which had been hovering near 12 degrees at sunrise, climbed slightly through the morning the way it sometimes did before bad weather. By noon, the sky had taken on a flat metallic color that old Tobias Hennessy would later describe as the color of a gun barrel left too long in the rain. At the trading post, he stopped what he was doing, walked outside without his coat, and stood looking north for nearly a full minute. Then he went home and did not return for 9 days. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature had begun to fall, and it fell with a speed that left no time for argument. In the space of 3 hours, it dropped 41 degrees. Men working outside felt the change against their faces and ran for shelter before they understood what was happening. Ranchers driving livestock toward winter pens found their hands going numb inside their gloves. By 4 o'clock, the first hard gusts had reached the basin floor, and by 5, the wind was screaming down from the mountains at a sustained 60 miles per hour, with gusts that bent telegraph poles 30 miles to the south. Snow did not fall that evening. It arrived. It came sideways out of the darkness in white sheets that tore the visibility down to less than 10 feet at the height of the storm. Fence lines vanished within the first hour. Barns disappeared from the view of the houses they stood beside. 2 men caught between their cabins and their wood piles became lost in their own yards, and survived only because they remembered to turn around and follow their own boot prints back before the snow filled them in. Inside the Reed homestead, Josiah and his wife and their 3 children gathered close to the stove and listened to the roar building outside the walls. The cabin was a sound structure, built 6 years earlier by Josiah himself with timber he had cut from the slopes east of the property. He had taken pride in the tightness of its chinking and the squareness of its corners. But within the first hour of the blizzard, he began to notice the cold finding its way inside. A thread of air worked through a hairline gap beneath the front door. Another slipped down past the window frame in the north wall. The chinking on the windward side, which had appeared sound at his last autumn inspection, had shrunk during the dry weeks of summer in ways he had not detected, and the storm now searched out every fault with relentless patience. By 8 o'clock that evening, frost had begun forming on the inside of the north wall logs. Thin white lines appeared first, then small patches, then a creeping rime that spread across the timber like something alive. Josiah fed the stove harder. His wife wrapped the youngest child in 2 blankets and then in a third. The thermometer he had nailed beside the stove, almost identical to the one Cordelia kept across the way, was reading 38 degrees. He fed the stove again. By midnight, it had not climbed above 41. The wood pile he had built beside the back door, which he had estimated would last the family 10 days of hard winter, was already a third gone, and the storm had been blowing for less than 9 hours. 300 yards to the north, the same wind beat against the hatch cabin with the same fury. The same temperature pressed against the same walls. The roar of the blizzard surrounded the homestead in the same way. But inside, the sound arrived strangely muted, stripped of its edges, the way a shouting voice sounds when heard through a thick layer of wool. The walls did not creak. The chinking did not whistle. The cold did not find the cracks because the cracks themselves had been buried beneath 3 feet of sunflower stalks, dried sage, woven seed heads, and the countless tiny pockets of trapped air that lived between them. Banjo slept on his rug beside the stove with his head on his paws. Emmeline read by lamplight at the kitchen table. Cordelia, holding her tin cup of coffee, walked to the wall and read the thermometer. 63 degrees. The storm did not break until the morning of December 16. For nearly 36 unbroken hours, the wind hammered the Judith Basin without pause, without weakening, without offering a single lull that a man might have used to check on a neighbor or fetch more wood from a buried pile. When the silence finally arrived in the gray hour before sunrise, it came so abruptly that several families later reported being woken by it, the absence of the noise more startling than the noise itself. Josiah Reed spent the better part of 2 hours digging his front door free of the drift that had built against it. The snow stood waist-high in places and shoulder-high against the north side of the cabin. Fence lines had been erased completely. Half of his sheep had survived inside the windbreak shed he had reinforced the previous autumn, but 3 of the older ewes had not, and a 4th would not last the day. The cabin itself had survived, though barely. New cracks had opened along the chinking of the north wall, thin lines of daylight visible now through places that had been sealed before the storm. The wood pile inside the house was down to a single armload. Josiah stood in his yard for a long time, looking at the damage and breathing in air so cold it stung the inside of his nose. Then he turned and looked across the open field toward the Hatch homestead. A thin ribbon of smoke was rising from the chimney over there. Not the heavy black smoke of a stove being fed desperately, but a steady, pale, almost lazy thread that drifted up into the still morning air as if no extraordinary thing had happened in the night. He pulled on his coat and walked. The snow came over the tops of his boots, and the going was hard. By the time he reached the Hatch property line, he was sweating beneath his coat despite the temperature, which the thermometer on his porch had read as -19 when he left the house. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the cabin. What he saw, he would describe years later to his grandchildren as the strangest thing he had ever witnessed on the Montana frontier. The Hatch cabin no longer looked like a cabin. It looked like a low mound rising out of the snowfield, a shape so completely buried beneath drift and frozen sunflower stalks that only the chimney and the narrow black rectangle of the door broke its outline. The outer surface of the sunflower skin had taken severe punishment. Whole sections of stalks along the windward side had been stripped down to bare nubs. Loose fibers hung frozen beneath crusts of ice. The top layer of bundles had been flattened or torn away entirely in places, but the core remained. Beneath the ruined outer shell, the dense inner layer still hugged the cabin walls. What had been lost had served its purpose. The damaged surface had absorbed the violence of the storm so that the protected interior beneath it had never been touched. Josiah crossed the yard and knocked on the door. Cordelia opened it, and a wave of warm air rolled out around her so abruptly that he stepped back without meaning to. He smelled coffee. He smelled bread that had been baked recently. He saw Emmeline at the kitchen table eating porridge with milk poured over the top of it, the same breakfast she might have eaten on any quiet morning in October. He saw Banjo lift his gray head from the rug beside the stove, regard him without alarm, and lay it down again. He saw no blankets piled on the chairs, no fingers wrapped around cups for warmth, no expressions of 2 people who had spent the past day and a half fighting a war against the cold. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 61 degrees. He looked at the wood box beside the stove, still half full. Cordelia stepped back and gestured him inside without speaking. He came in and stood on the rag rug just inside the door, snow melting from his boots into small dark puddles on the wood. Cordelia poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table. Then she lifted the ledger from its shelf and placed it beside the cup. She did not say a word. She simply opened the cover to the most recent pages and let him read. Josiah Reed read the ledger in silence while his coffee cooled in front of him. The entries were brief. written in the small, careful hand of a woman who had taught herself to record only what mattered. He found the column for December 14, then the entries for the long hours of December 15, and finally the lines written on the morning of December 16, just before he had knocked at the door. The interior temperature of the hatch cabin had never fallen below 58 degrees during the entire blizzard. The wood consumption across 2 of the hardest days in the basin's memory was less than half of what he had burned in the same span. He turned back to compare. He turned forward to check again. The numbers did not change. He closed the ledger and sat looking at the cover for a long time. Then he rose without finishing his coffee, walked to the nearest wall, and rested his open palm against the timber. The wood was warm. Not heated, not hot, simply warm in the way a log feels when it has held its temperature through the night instead of surrendering it. He stood with his hand on the wall and thought about his own cabin 300 yards away, where the frost had crept across the inside of the logs by midnight, and where his wife had wrapped their youngest in 3 blankets and still felt the child shivering through them. He lowered his hand slowly. Then he turned and looked at Cordelia, who was standing beside the stove, holding a wooden spoon in one hand and waiting without expression for him to say whatever he had come to say. "I was wrong, Mrs. Hatch." The words arrived quietly, but they did not need to be louder. The storm itself had already done the arguing. Cordelia nodded once and turned back to her pot on the stove, and that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of everything that followed. Spring returned to the Judith Basin in the slow, uncertain way Montana springs always did. The snow retreated from the lower flats first, then from the slopes, then from the shaded hollows beneath the cottonwoods along the creek. The first green showed itself in early April. By the second week of May, planting season had arrived in earnest, and Josiah Reed surprised a great many people in the basin when he walked out to his cabin with a small cloth bag of sunflower seeds and began pressing them into the soil along his foundation logs. Not in a garden, not beside a fence, against the walls, exactly where Cordelia Hatch had planted hers a year before. A few of his neighbors saw him at work and rode past without comment. Some pretended not to notice. By midsummer, 2 other families had begun planting the same way. The year after that, there were 6. Silas Pendry never publicly acknowledged that any of his concerns had been mistaken, though many of them had not been. Instead, the carpenter approached the matter the way good craftsmen approach most things. He studied it. He measured the spacing between bundles, the angle of the support stakes, the way Cordelia braided her cords. Within 3 seasons, he had developed a refined method of his own, which he sold to settlers across the basin, without ever once mentioning the woman who had taught him the principle. Ezra Whitcomb stopped making jokes about the ledger. The subject quietly disappeared from conversations at the trading post, the way subjects often did when an idea stopped being controversial and started becoming useful. The nickname faded too. People no longer spoke of the Sunflower Widow or the Yellow Folly. The cabin earned a different name in time, one the basin used without thinking. They called it the Flower Wall, and within 10 years, the phrase had become a general term across that whole stretch of Montana country, applied to any homestead that had adopted the practice. Emmeline grew into adulthood on that homestead. Banjo's muzzle whitened and his steps slowed, and one quiet afternoon in his 14th year he went asleep beneath the kitchen window and did not wake. Daniel Hatch's coat still hung behind the door. The axe still rested beside the stove. Cordelia never remarried. She did not need to. She had already built the wall that mattered, and somewhere beyond every horizon, another winter was always waiting. By then, many walls had learned to wait for it.